The Politics of the Dome, the Transatlantic Lock, Part 2 of the Hypersonic Gap. Part 1 made the technical case for the Golden Dome, the only architecture that can stop a maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle. Part 2 makes the harder case, the case for how the dome gets built. Because the hardest fight is not with the adversary, it is within the alliance. This is the story of the inflection point that forced the West to scramble, the industrial friction that nearly broke the transatlantic partnership, the secret space race among 12 Pentagon contractors, the live-fire countdown that proved the architecture works, the left-of-launch doctrine that hunts the weapon on the ground, and the trillion-dollar cost of survival. Act 1. The inflection point. In August 2021, a long-range rocket lifted off from a launch facility deep within mainland China. To Western early warning radars, the initial trajectory resembled a standard ballistic launch, the kind of predictable flight path that defense systems had been designed to track for over half a century. But instead of continuing along a traditional parabolic arc into space before falling toward a pre-calculated destination, the vehicle did something unprecedented. It entered a stable, low-Earth orbit, circling the globe in a polar trajectory, crossing over Antarctica and approaching the continental United States from the south. A geographic blind spot, completely undefended by ground-based mid-course radars looking northward over the Arctic. This was the unveiling of China's Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, or FOBS, paired with a nuclear-capable hypersonic glide vehicle. Though the weapon ultimately missed its precise target by roughly 24 miles, the strategic shockwaves reverberated instantly through the highest corridors of the Pentagon. United States intelligence had not simply missed a milestone, they had witnessed the practical rewriting of global strategic stability. For decades, global security had been anchored by the predictable geometry of the Ballistic Age. If an adversary launched a missile, radar physics and Keplerian mechanics allowed defense systems to calculate exactly where it would land within moments of booster burnout. The 2021 Chinese test marked the definitive death of that predictability and the chaotic birth of the hypersonic chaos age. In this new era, an offensive weapon could orbit the planet undetected, change direction at will, underfly strategic defenses, and hold any city on Earth at risk with less than 10 minutes of warning time. What began as an intelligence shock in East Asia quickly transformed into a bloody operational reality on the battlefields of Eastern Europe. Throughout 2023 and the subsequent years, Russia began routine combat employment of its own hypersonic and aeroballistic arsenals against high-value infrastructure and air defense nodes in Ukraine. The air-launched Kh-47M2 Kinzhal and the ship-launched scramjet-powered 3M22 Zircon were no longer theoretical threats confined to Russian state propaganda videos or military parades. They became live-fire proof that hypersonic warfare had matured from a technological aspiration into an active operational doctrine. Western observers watched as these weapons routinely challenged tactical defense networks. While localized point defense batteries scored occasional, highly celebrated intercepts against the Kinzhal during its predictable terminal dive, the broader strategic takeaway was clear. Hypersonic weapons possessed the velocity and atmospheric agility to reliably penetrate conventional theater air defenses. The kinetic energy alone of a weapon traveling at Mach 6 or Mach 8 obliterated hardened targets even without a conventional explosive warhead. These strikes demonstrated that near-peer adversaries had successfully weaponized the upper atmosphere, the high endo-atmospheric zone between 30 and 80 kilometers above the Earth, creating a deadly sanctuary where conventional surface-to-air missiles lacked the maneuverability to engage, and strategic mid-course interceptors lacked the atmospheric capability to survive. The shield was broken, and the geopolitical landscape had fundamentally shifted before a viable countermeasure could even leave the drawing board. The shock was compounded by scale. By the summer of 2026, open intelligence reporting confirmed what planners had feared. China was on a trajectory toward roughly 4,000 hypersonic weapons, and Russia toward 1,000 by the year 2035. Combined, that is a tripling of projected inventory, a shift from the boutique, demonstration weapons of the early 2020s to mass-saturating first-day-of-war arsenals. China fielded the DF-17 with its DF-ZF glide vehicle as its primary strike system, an estimated 100 to 150 units already deployed, alongside the ship-launched YJ-19 and the air-launched CJ-1000 scramjet cruise missiles. Russia held the intercontinental Avangard glide vehicle, the Zircon scramjet cruise missile, and the air-launched Kinzhal, depleted by combat in Ukraine but still in the field. The political consequence was as urgent as the military one. This was no longer a laboratory problem or a procurement line item. It was a strategic shortage with a deadline, and it forced the Transatlantic Alliance to confront a question it had deferred for a decade. Who builds the shield, who pays for it, and who commands the architecture that no single nation could field alone? The answer would determine the industrial fate of Western defense for a generation, because the shield could not be bought off the shelf and it could not be built in pieces. It had to be architected as one connected system, from the launch pad in the adversary's territory to the kill vehicle in orbit, and every node in between had to share a single, real-time picture of the sky. Act 2. The industrial friction. The technical remedy to this vulnerability was readily apparent to strategic planners on both sides of the Atlantic. A highly integrated, multi-layered defensive network that could fuse tactical theater-level systems with an overarching space-based architecture. In Europe, this vision centered on the Freya program, an advanced, next-generation theater air defense system engineered to engage fast, air-breathing threats and low-end hypersonic cruise missiles at the edge of the atmosphere. But as the technical blueprints for Freya matured, European defense ministers and industrial consortiums collided with a harsh kinetic reality. No matter how advanced Freya's interceptor missile became, the system would remain effectively blind without the global, persistent tracking data provided by the United States Space Force and its burgeoning Space Development Agency low Earth orbit satellite constellation. This realization ignited an intense, highly sensitive diplomatic tug-of-war. For the Freya program to succeed against maneuvering hypersonic threats, the United States had to be granted direct entry into the program as a primary partner, and American defense leadership had to take the helm of the overarching orbital integration. Yet the path toward this transatlantic lock was instantly choked by a dense morass of bureaucratic and political friction. The alliance's greatest vulnerability wasn't engineering, it was paperwork. At the center of the dispute stood the United States International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR. These stringent export control laws, designed to protect sensitive American military technology, became an immediate barrier to collaborative engineering. European partners, particularly France and Germany, expressed deep-seated anxieties over technology sharing protocols. They feared that incorporating American defense giants into the Freya architecture would allow Washington to assert regulatory control over European defense exports, effectively stripping Brussels of its strategic autonomy. European industrial players resisted what they perceived as an American corporate takeover of a homegrown program, arguing that decades of European aerospace innovation would be subordinated to the proprietary data standards of the American military-industrial complex. They wanted an independent shield, built by European hands, serving European sovereignty. However, sovereign pride could not rewrite the laws of physics. Hypersonic cruise missiles like the Russian Zircon travel at speeds that compress the radar horizon of any surface-based system to the point of operational uselessness. A ground-based radar belonging to a Freya battery would only detect an incoming hypersonic missile once it cleared the Earth's curvature, leaving a total engagement window of less than 60 seconds, far too short for a standard command and control loop to fire an interceptor. To defeat an atmospheric threat traveling a mile per second, a defense system requires continuous birth-to-death tracking from low Earth orbit, calculating the weapon's non-ballistic deviations in real time and passing those mid-course corrections directly to the interceptor before it ever breaks the local radar horizon. The United States possessed the only space architecture capable of filling this gap through the Space Development Agency's proliferated warfighter space architecture. European leadership ultimately faced a stark choice: maintain absolute industrial purity and field an isolated tactical system that could be easily bypassed by an adversary's hypersonic maneuvers, or accept American industrial leadership and link Freya into a global, space-fused network. By negotiating an unprecedented data-sharing framework that bridged ITAR restrictions while preserving European component manufacturing, the alliance slowly began to forge the Transatlantic Lock. The United States would enter the Freya program to standardize theater-level hypersonic cruise missile defense, while simultaneously leading the development of the strategic Golden Dome, fusing European tactical agility with America's global orbital reach. The mechanism that made the lock possible was the Space Development Agency's proliferated warfighter space architecture, a mesh of low Earth orbit tracking and transport satellites designed to see a hypersonic weapon from ignition to impact and pass that track in microseconds across laser crosslinks to every shooter in the chain. No European nation possessed anything comparable, and none had the launch cadence or the industrial base to build one in the time the threat demanded. The choice was therefore not between European independence and American dominance. It was between an isolated European system that would be blind against a maneuvering target the moment it crossed the horizon, and a fused system in which European engineering handled the air-breathing and cruise missile tier, while American orbital sensing fed the engagement from above. The negotiated resolution preserved European component manufacturing and sovereign industrial contribution while binding the data architecture to the American space layer. France and Germany kept their aerospace primes inside the Freya supply chain. Washington kept command of the orbital picture. The compromise was not elegant, and it satisfied no one entirely, which is usually the sign that it was the only compromise that could hold. The Transatlantic Lock was forged not in ambition, but in physics. A ground radar sees a Mach 6 cruise missile for less than 60 seconds after it clears the curvature, and no command loop on Earth can close that loop alone. Act 3. The Contractor Race. With the political framework of the Transatlantic Alliance stabilized, the operational focus shifted from diplomatic chambers to the highly classified defense industrial marketplace. The Missile Defense Agency and the United States Space Force recognized that while a US-infused Freya could manage the lower air-breathing hypersonic cruise missile tier, the upper boundary, where high-velocity hypersonic glide vehicles like the Chinese DF-17 or Russian Avangard operate, demanded an entirely new class of orbital hardware. Under the auspices of the Golden Dome architecture, the Pentagon initiated a high-stakes, largely secret industrial space race, awarding prototype development contracts to 12 distinct defense and technology firms, with the aggressive mandate to achieve initial operational capability by 2028. This procurement battle set off a profound philosophical and structural schism within the American defense sector, pitting the traditional titans of the aerospace establishment against an aggressive vanguard of Silicon Valley disruptors. The legacy defense giants, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics, approached the challenge through the lens of evolutionary engineering. Backed by billions of dollars in foundational research and decades of institutional memory, these firms sought to adapt the proven hyper-optimized kinetic kill vehicle logic of the Patriot PAC-3 MSE and Aegis SM-3 programs for orbital deployment. Their design philosophy favored heavy, highly sophisticated, and immensely expensive multi-stage interceptors equipped with advanced multi-mode seekers and complex divert and attitude control thrusters. These systems were engineered for near-perfect reliability, designed to execute precise, hit-to-kill intercepts against high-velocity targets through sheer computational supremacy and exquisite mechanical execution. To the legacy contractors, the Golden Dome was an extension of the classic missile defense paradigm, a select network of high-value assets built to withstand the ultimate rigor of strategic conflict. Directly opposing this traditional methodology was a coalition of agile, venture-backed disruptors and commercial space leaders, including Anduril Industries, SpaceX, True Anomaly, Quindar, Turion Space Corp, Gaitai USA, SciTech, and Booz Allen Hamilton. These companies rejected the premise that hypersonic defense could be sustained by multi-million-dollar boutique interceptors. Instead, they championed a philosophy of rapid, disposable, mass-produced orbital architecture. Leveraging SpaceX's low-cost Falcon 9 and Starship launch infrastructure, this faction envisioned an adversarial target saturation strategy. Their proposals called for hundreds of small, autonomous, low-cost kinetic interceptors distributed across low Earth orbit constellations. Instead of relying on a single, flawless interceptor, these companies designed systems where clusters of smart, software-defined space vehicles could autonomously coordinate to intercept an incoming glide vehicle, using swarm logic and commercial off-the-shelf guidance systems to overwhelm the threat. Companies like Anduril focused on artificial intelligence-driven sensor fusion at the edge, while True Anomaly developed rapid maneuver autonomous vehicles capable of launching on short notice to intercept threats in the boost phase. This classified space race transformed the industrial landscape, forcing the Pentagon to balance the unmatched technical maturity of Patriot-derived legacy systems against the economic resilience and sheer scale offered by the commercial space revolution. The final architecture of the Golden Dome would not belong to one philosophy alone. It was rapidly becoming a hybrid network, combining the exquisite targeting sensors of the defense establishment with the mass-produced orbital platforms of the tech sector. Each firm brought a piece no other could. Anduril's edge was artificial intelligence-driven sensor fusion, teaching the constellation to sort a real warhead from decoys and debris in real time. True Anomaly built the rapid maneuver autonomous vehicles that could ride a commercial launch and reposition to intercept a boosting threat on short notice. Quindar handled the orbital traffic management that kept hundreds of interceptors from colliding with the very satellites they relied on. Turion pushed the disposable interceptor economics, and Gaitai contributed the on-orbit servicing that kept the constellation refreshed without a full replacement launch. SpaceX was the industrial backbone. Its Falcon 9 and Starship cadence made it possible to put the architecture in orbit at a tempo the legacy primes could not match, and its Starlink-derived bus lowered the unit cost of a tracking satellite by an order of magnitude. The Missile Defense Agency understood that no single camp could win the race alone. The exquisite kill vehicle, perfected over decades by Lockheed and Raytheon, required the mass and the refresh rate only the commercial sector could provide. The commercial sector, in turn, required the combat-proven guidance logic and the reliability standards the legacy primes had earned through live intercept. The 2028 initial operational capability target was not a prediction. It was a deadline forced by the intelligence on the adversary's production rate, and the hybrid architecture was the only answer that could meet it. Act 4. Project Maverick Countdown. The culmination of this industrial and political synthesis was slated for evaluation inside a highly classified command bunker at the Missile Defense Integration and Operations Center in Colorado. It is the summer of fiscal year 2027, and the military personnel monitoring the multispectral display walls are executing Project Maverick, the first comprehensive live-fire operational test of the integrated Golden Dome architecture against a simulated maximum-threat hypersonic glide vehicle trajectory. On the primary tactical plot, a red vector appears off the southeastern coast of the United States. The tracking system registers a simulated launch of a Chinese DF-17 variant from an ocean-going platform, accelerating violently through the atmosphere. Within 40 seconds of engine ignition, the missile's massive rocket booster burns hot and bright, radiating an intense thermal infrared signature into the upper atmosphere. High above the cloud layer, the Space Development Agency's tracking satellites detect the plume instantly, their wide-field infrared sensors locking onto the target and initiating the global kill chain. Inside the command center, the automated voice of the Battle Management Command, Control, and Communications System announces the track generation. The countdown timer begins, flashing in single-digit seconds. At 1 minute and 20 seconds, the system confirms track generation. The low Earth orbit sensor link is active. At 1 minute 45, booster burnout is detected, the hypersonic glide vehicle separating at 65 kilometers of altitude. At 2 minutes 10, the target initiates a lateral maneuver, and the correlation delta registers across every display in the bunker. At 1 minute and 45 seconds into the flight, the booster burns out and detaches. The hypersonic glide vehicle separates, plunging back into the thin air of the upper atmosphere at Mach 15, immediately converting its extreme velocity into lift. It begins its glide phase, pulling a sharp, unpredicted lateral maneuver, veering 30 degrees off its initial ballistic heading. On the command center displays, the traditional parabolic prediction line generated by legacy ground-based systems snaps and expands into a massive red cloud of mathematical uncertainty. If this were a conventional defense network, the target would now be lost, having escaped the rigid prediction matrix of surface radars. But the low Earth orbit satellite layer maintains its unblinking track, passing continuous microsecond coordinate updates down via laser crosslinks to a forward-deployed Aegis destroyer and a baseline Patriot radar battery positioned along the coastline. The engagement window has shrunk to 18 seconds. The Freya interceptor launch is initiated at 2 minutes 40. At 3 minutes and 5 seconds, the downward kinetic stage deploys, and the closure velocity exceeds Mach 22. At 3 minutes 18, intercept is confirmed. Target destroyed. Data correlation terminated. The engagement window has shrunk to less than 20 seconds as the vehicle enters the high endoatmospheric layer. The tracking data is handed off seamlessly to a newly integrated US-European Freya battery. The system's command logic calculates the intercept geometry, accounting for the target's continuous atmospheric skipping. The Freya interceptor roars out of its vertical launch cell, its solid ramjet motor igniting instantly to push the missile past Mach 6 on a direct head-on intercept vector. Simultaneously, an orbital kinetic interceptor, deployed from a Golden Dome satellite container directly overhead, fires its divert thrusters, plunging downward into the atmosphere to meet the threat from above. The closure speed between the two objects exceeds Mach 22. Inside the command bunker, the tactical displays show the two vectors converging in a fraction of a second. The tracking loop must account for extreme thermal blinding caused by the friction plasma surrounding the HGV. At 32 miles above the ocean, the orbital kill vehicle's optical seeker overrides the radar handoff, locking onto the dense core of the hypersonic thermal bloom. A final burst of its attitude motors corrects its path by mere inches. The display screen blinks as the two icons merge, replaced by a green indicator code confirming a successful kinetic hit-to-kill impact. The maneuvering threat is obliterated by sheer force of physical impact, validating the multi-layered tracking loop before the target could ever descend into its terminal dive. The significance of the test lay less in the single intercept than in the chain it proved end-to-end. The thermal bloom of a vehicle moving at Mach 15 creates a friction plasma sheath that blinds conventional radar seekers, which is precisely why terminal phase interceptors fail against glide vehicles. The Project Maverick engagement solved the problem by geometry rather than by brute sensing. The orbital kill vehicle descended into the plasma cone from above, where the densest heat was behind the target relative to its seeker, and locked onto the thermal core rather than the leading edge. The low Earth orbit tracking layer maintained the microsecond coordinate updates that the surface radars could not hold. and the laser crosslinks carried those updates to both the Freya battery and the orbital interceptor simultaneously, so that the two shooters operated on a single shared picture rather than two offset ones. The Battle Management Command, Control, and Communication System coordinated the handoff without human latency in the loop because the engagement window permitted no human decision time. What the bunker witnessed was not a missile defeating a missile. It was an architecture defeating a trajectory. The first proof that a connected, space-fused, transatlantic kill chain could hold a maneuvering hypersonic through the hardest phase of its flight and destroy it before the terminal dive. The political value of that proof exceeded the military one. It gave the alliance the single artifact it had lacked, a demonstrated, repeatable success that could be taken to parliaments, to finance ministries, and to defense ministers as evidence that the trillion-dollar investment produced a system that actually worked. Act 5, left of launch. While the success of the Project Maverick test demonstrated that a mid-course kinetic intercept was mechanically possible, senior planners within the Joint Chiefs of Staff maintained a sobering perspective. Relying entirely on kinetic interceptors to shoot down a maneuvering Mach 15 missile was an inherently dangerous backstop defensive strategy. In a full-scale regional conflict, an adversary would not launch a single hypersonic weapon. They would deploy massed salvos designed to overwhelm the radar channels and exhaust the physical magazine capacity of any defensive system. To truly secure the skies, the military could not simply play goalie. They had to implement a comprehensive left-of-launch doctrine. The best way to stop a hypersonic weapon is to kill it on the ground, disrupting the kill chain before the rocket fuel ever ignites. This offensive-defensive paradigm shifted the burden of hypersonic defense away from traditional interceptor batteries and onto the silent capabilities of the cyber, electronic warfare, and special operations communities. The modern hypersonic weapon is an incredibly complex system of systems, requiring precise, high-fidelity data streams to function. Before a missile like the DF-17 can be launched, it must receive highly accurate meteorological data, orbital target handoffs, and pre-flight guidance programming. Cyber command operators target these digital dependencies months before kinetic hostilities ever commence, infiltrating the adversary's command and control networks to plant latent, highly sophisticated logic bombs. By disrupting the secure data links between primary military headquarters and forward-deployed mobile launcher units, cyber warfare can induce systemic software failures, causing a missile's internal guidance system to fail during its pre-launch calibration sequence, effectively neutralizing the weapon while it sits idle on its transport vehicle. Simultaneously, electronic warfare assets operating from long-range stealth platforms and covert offshore positions target the specialized telemetry and satellite communication nodes required to monitor hypersonic testing and deployment. By flooding these critical frequencies with advanced non-kinetic waveforms, electronic warfare units can spoof the automated fueling networks and diagnostic sensors of hypersonic launch facilities. If an automated system falsely reads an imbalance in a liquid propellant scramjet engine or detects a simulated structural fracture in a glide vehicle's thermal shielding, the launch sequence is automatically aborted by the command computer. For fixed, hardened infrastructure like the tunnel networks and underground silos housing Russia's avant-garde ICBM boosters, deep penetrating special operations teams and long-range stealth strikes are assigned to sever the critical power grids, cooling plants, and communications lines feeding the launch complexes. By severing the physical nervous system of the launch site, the weapons are effectively trapped within their fortresses. Left of launch converts the adversary's technological complexity into their greatest vulnerability, ensuring that the Golden Dome is never forced to face a saturation threat alone. Left of launch also solved the problem the interceptors could not: magazine depth. A Golden Dome constellation, however large, carries a finite number of kill vehicles in accessible orbit, and a saturation salvo is designed to exhaust that magazine. By reducing the number of weapons that ever leave the pad, left of launch converts an unwinnable arithmetic problem into a manageable one. The cost-exchange ratio inverts completely on the ground. A DF-17 glide vehicle costs an estimated $15 to $25 million. A cyber operation that disables its guidance upload costs effectively nothing. A special operations strike that destroys a transporter erector launcher costs less than the missile it removes from the adversary's order of battle. The doctrine is not a replacement for the dome. It is the layer beneath the layer, the ground the adversary stands on, hunted and infiltrated before the rocket fuel ever ignites. The two strategies compound. The adversary, knowing its launchers are being tracked and its command networks are being penetrated, faces a defense in depth that begins in its own territory and ends in orbit, with no safe moment in the kill chain and no safe place to launch. That is the architecture's true shape, not a roof alone, and not walls and a roof, but a perimeter that starts at the adversary's silo and closes at the kill vehicle in the sky. Act 6, the cost of survival. Ultimately, the realization of the Golden Dome and the integration of the Freya program brought the United States and its transatlantic allies face to face with an inescapable, monumental economic reality. In public testimonies before the Senate Armed Services Committee, senior Pentagon officials and the leadership of the Missile Defense Agency were forced to deliver a stark, unvarnished admission. Under current defense configurations, the West remained profoundly vulnerable to massed hypersonic strikes. The existing financial cost-exchange ratio was overwhelmingly tilted in favor of the offense. An adversary could manufacture a highly destructive hypersonic cruise missile, or aeroballistic weapon, for an estimated $3 to $5 million. To counter that single threat under legacy paradigms, Western forces had to fire a salvo of multiple interceptors, each costing upward of $15 million, simply to guarantee a statistically viable probability of kill. This was an economic equation that spelled eventual systemic bankruptcy for the defender. The Golden Dome architecture was designed to fundamentally flip this cost-exchange ratio, shifting the economic advantage back to the defense through the use of space-based kinetic interceptors and shared industrial infrastructure. But the price tag for establishing this orbital equilibrium was staggering. Independent analyses by the Congressional Budget Office and international strategic institutes projected the total life cycle cost of the completed Golden Dome network, spanning its low Earth orbit sensor constellations, the space-based interceptor layers, the standardization of the Freya program, and decades of operational maintenance, at between $542 billion and $1.75 trillion. This monumental figure ignited fierce political debates across Western parliaments, with critics questioning whether such an astronomical expenditure was justified in an era of pressing domestic economic challenges and competing social priorities. Yet, as strategic planners finalized the architecture of the Transatlantic Lock, the debate ultimately transcended simple budgetary arithmetic. The fundamental question was no longer what a secure sky cost to build, but what an undefended sky would cost if it failed. The financial loss of a single Western carrier strike group, the destruction of a critical financial capital's power grid, or the neutralization of an entire theater logistics hub by unintercepted hypersonic salvos would instantly incur costs that dwarfed the trillion-dollar investment of the dome. In the calculus of 21st century statecraft, the Golden Dome was not an optional military luxury. It was the baseline cost of national survival. By cementing the political, industrial, and technological bonds between the United States and Europe, the alliance chose to shoulder the immense financial burden of deterrence, closing the fatal hole at the top of the shield and ensuring that the global balance of power would not be dictated by the speed of an adversary's missile. The deeper argument the dome settled was one of deterrence by cost imposition. For the entire history of missile defense, the economics ran in the attacker's favor. The offense was cheaper than the defense, and saturation was therefore inevitable. A credible, scalable, space-based boost phase interceptor reverses that arithmetic for the first time. The marginal cost of an intercept drops toward the cost of the kinetic kill vehicle itself, or, for directed energy variants, toward the cost of the electricity to fire the laser. The interceptor becomes cheaper than the threat it destroys. The adversary, having spent a decade and billions to field a glide vehicle, watches it destroyed in the first 3 minutes of flight by a system it can neither outproduce, deter, nor counter. China does not build 4,000 glide vehicles to have them shot down before they maneuver. Russia does not sustain 1,000. The mere existence of a credible architecture changes the adversary's calculus before a single shot is fired, which is the definition of deterrence, succeeding silently. This is the strategic return on the trillion-dollar investment, and it is the reason the cost of the dome must be measured against the cost of its absence. An undefended sky does not remain cheap. A single carrier strike group lost, a single financial capital's grid taken down, a single theater logistics hub neutralized by a salvo that could not be stopped would each cost more than the entire architecture. The alliance did not choose to afford the dome. It chose to recognize that the alternative was unaffordable, and that the Transatlantic Lock was the mechanism by which the choice could be made together rather than alone. The politics of the dome. The Transatlantic Lock.